Hello students, welcome to financial accounting class. In the previous class we were dealing with how the uh, account sales, that is how the consignee prepares the account sales. So this was the format that we dealt with. Okay, and now in today's class we'll be dealing with the difference between consignment and sales. Okay, well, now even in consignment we are selling, in consignment also we are selling the goods, whereas in case of sales also we sell the goods. Okay, so there has to be some difference between the consignment and sales, isn't it? Well, now the first thing in case of consignment is the ownership of goods remains with the owner, that is with the consigner. The owner, that is the consigner, is only giving right to the consignee to sell the goods, but when he's giving the right, he's not transferring the ownership. Okay, he's only giving him the right to sell the goods. That's why here in case of consignment the ownership of goods remains with the owner, that is the consigner. When it comes to sales, the ownership of goods is transferred from the seller to the buyer. That is, here the ownership of goods is being transferred once the seller gets the amount for the goods that he's selling. Then in that case the ownership of the goods is being transferred from the seller to the buyer. Okay, here the ownership gets transferred from the seller to the buyer, whereas in case of consignment the ownership remains only with the consigner. It does not goes to the consignee. Next, the relationship between the consigner and the consignee is like the owner and the agent. Okay, there the relationship between the consigner and the consignee is the owner is the consigner and the agent is the consignee. Whereas in case of sales, here the relationship is in terms of buyer and debtor is like, the seller and the buyer is like debtor and creditor. Okay, the relationship between the seller is nothing but the debtor, whereas the buyer is considered as the creditor. Suppose if the seller is, I mean, you know what is debtor and credit, that is, even if the goods are being sold on credit basis. Okay, so the seller here, the buyer becomes here the creditor, debtor, and so on. Okay, so the relationship between the seller and the buyer is like the debtor and the creditor. The risk of goods remains with the consigner and the goods are sold by the consignee. Who is bearing all the risk of the goods? In the previous class we have checked, when the account sales is being prepared, the expenses are being borne, all the expenses what are being made on the goods are being borne by the consigner. Okay, so any risk which is relating to the goods, it is borne by the consigner and not by the consignee. Okay, only the goods are being sold by the consignee, but the risk of the goods is remaining with the, it remains with the consigner only. That is, anything happens to the goods while transit, okay, or any loss or any damage which happens to the goods, then it is all which is being borne by the owner, that is the consigner, not the consignee. The consignee is only selling the goods. Okay, the here in case of sales, the risk of goods is transferred from the seller to the buyer. Okay, any risk which has been which relating to goods is being transferred from the seller to the buyer. Once the goods are being sold, entire risk of the goods is being borne by the buyer, not the seller. Only till the goods until the goods are being sold. Okay, the risk remains with the seller, but once the goods have been sold, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer. The next owner will be bearing the risk. Okay, next point, the expenses incurred on goods are borne by the consigner. I have already told you this point, that is, any expenses on the goods are being borne by the owner, not the agent. Okay, whereas in case of sales, the expenses incurred on goods are being borne by the purchaser. Okay, now here purchaser means, suppose if I am purchasing the goods, okay, so then the expenses are being borne by me. Suppose if I transfer the goods, that is I sell the goods to some other person, so the other person who is purchasing those goods, expenses are being borne by the other person, not me, because then I turn to be a seller. Okay, so here the expenses incurred on the goods are being borne by the purchaser and not the seller. Whereas in case of consignment, the expenses are being borne by the owner. Okay, next. Consignee can return the goods to the consignor at the as the goods are not sold by to the consignee. Now here, suppose if the consignee has received 100 goods for sales. Okay, now if the consignee has sold only 95 goods and 5 goods are remaining with the consignee, in that case those 5 goods can be returned to the owner, that is the consignor. He can return those goods back to the owner, to the consignor, because why he is returning? Because those goods are not sold to the consignee. Consignee only has the right to sell the goods. So if any unsold goods are there, then it can be returned to the consignor. But when it comes to sales, returns is not possible. Why? Because the goods are being sold. Once you sell the goods, you won't take it back, or you will have a selected amount of time, that is within that particular period of time there can be exchange being done, but not returns. Understanding? So here returns is not possible in case of sales, but you may have, suppose if there is any particular damage or so. Okay, and if it is in the terms and conditions, then within the terms and if it is within the terms and conditions, then yes, exchange may be possible. Understanding? But returns is not possible. Okay, next. Consignment has, in consignee, in consignment, consignee has to send details of account sales periodically to the owner, that is the consignor. Okay, whereas in case of sales, the purchaser need not send account details to the seller. Okay, in case of consignment, who is selling the details? The details are being sent by the consignee to the consignor regarding what is the amount of sales being made. Okay, how much is the price of the goods that was being quoted. All these details will be sent by the consignee to the consignor. Okay, but when it comes to sales, here there is no such details being sent by the purchaser to the seller. Okay, or seller to the purchaser, any of that case. Next, any unsold goods. Okay, unsold goods by the consignee is considered as stock by the consignor. Okay, now I give you the example of 100 goods. Okay, if there are 100 goods and 95 goods are being sold, 5 goods are still remaining, then those 5 goods are considered as stock of goods by the consignor. Okay, he is going to consider it as, that is the consignor is going to consider it as stock. Whereas when it comes to sales, any unsold goods with the purchaser is treated as stock of goods to the purchaser only, not the seller. Okay, it is any of the unsold goods, that is it remains with the purchaser only. Okay, the stock of goods is treated as any unsold goods with the purchaser is treated as stock of goods, is treated as stock of goods uh, to the purchaser and not the seller. I'm sorry, here it should be corrected. It is considered as stock of goods by the seller and not the purchaser. Okay, per that is the purchaser has nothing to do with the unsold goods. Okay, he only gets there's a correction to be made into this particular point. Any unsold goods with the which is there with the seller, it is treated as stock with the seller, not the purchaser. It should be in wherever purchaser is written, it should be a seller, not purchaser. Okay, next. Parties in consignment are the consignor and the consignee, whereas parties involved in sales is the seller and the buyer. There are two parties involved in consignment, consignor and the consignee, whereas in case of sales it is two parties which are involved, that is the buyer and the seller. I hope you have understood the difference between the consignment and sales. In the next class we'll deal with the next aspect. Thank you.